Hello, my name is Sussan Babaie. I am presenting a series of small conversations, if you will, um, uh, episodes around the subject of Persian painting. Um, and would like to start by looking straight away at a single page, this folio, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as a way for me to open up some of the issues that will become the subject of subsequent episodes, if you will, on this series on Persian painting. And I'd like to invite you to join me in the later examples or the later episodes. So I want to start by saying that this particular painting is detached from a Haft Peykar, or Seven Portraits, which is one of the stories or books of the Khamse of Nizami, that is famously known as the Quintet of Nizami. And in this one folio, which is detached from its manuscript, in other words, survives only in this single page and is now at the Metropolitan Museum, we see a scene of revelry, if you will, of women gathered in a garden, which is a fenced garden, with a pool where 5 of the women, naked from waist up, are swimming and playing in the water, which has become black because originally it was painted with silver, which is now oxidized and appears to be black. The painting is framed within the ruling, which is these beautifully marked edges, if you will, of the painting, against the background of the paper itself, colored and oftentimes gold flecked as well. The painting also benefits from an incredibly delicate use of the brush. These are small brushes with just a few very delicate hairs, which then use opaque watercolors and inks and gold and silver to carry out the painting onto this polished surface of the paper. I want to start by highlighting the measurements of this painting. The dimensions of it are essentially the height of 22.5 centimeters by 12.4 centimeters. That's the painting's size. In other words, that's a very small painting within which this incredibly sophisticated scene of gathering of a group of women engaged in a party, if you will, outdoors, is depicted. I also want to point to some details of this. We, the viewers, are held in a position as if we are hovering right in front and outside of the page, so we can see it from above. Hence this turning of the pool towards the viewer, so you can see all the figures in their silhouette. We can see the metal, red metal, or more likely wooden divide of the garden. So there is the outside and then inside of this platform of the pavilion, which is within a larger garden. You can see the wall of the garden at the far end of the painting, through which a stream of water enters and eventually, presumably, makes its way into the pool, which has these narrow channels parting to the other sides of the garden. In other words, what we see is probably a pictorial imagining of a kiosk, a kushk, a pavilion within a Chaharbagh garden, and that the pavilion is probably an 8-sided, an octagonal shaped pavilion, which is the description of such pavilions in Chaharbagh gardens of the period to which this painting belongs. It not only shows us the women playing in water, splashing around, but also their piled up clothes, which are sweetly thrown on the side here. They have attendants, of course. In other words, a sense of them being of a princely class, perhaps, with wine bottles or bottles for sherbet and drinks and cups and so forth, set aside or aside at the side of the pool. A musician and a woman who seems to be using castanetas, or maybe using her fingers to make the sound we know as bishkan. And indeed, the whole garden seems to be in a bloom. In other words, something of a ever blooming garden, kind of a spring, if you will. And this in honor of Nowrooz, which is the occasion for this series of mini talks about Persian painting. Most interestingly, perhaps, and curiously, is a detail in this window which projects out of the pavilion on the left-hand side, with a window just so open so that a man inside is looking out, eavesdropping on these women in the pool and down in the on the platform of this garden pavilion setup. Hence the name that the museum has given to this painting, the eavesdropper. Which is not a title that the painting comes with, but rather the painting itself depicts something of that very playful, and some might say even a slightly insidious aspect of an older man who seems to be eavesdropping on a group of naked women playing in the pool down in the lower part. This, in other words, indicates something of a particular social setting, of a particular, perhaps, environment that was private to the women, and that the presence of that man, in fact, disrupts the entire sort of the beauty of a spring outing in the garden pavilion and in the pool. What's beneath it, in other words, is part of the story that we may not quite grasp from this end of history, if you will, but that it was most likely understood by people who were looking at this painting in the first half of the 15th century. I will come back to that subject of storytelling and paintings, as Persian painting, for the most part, is associated with this small scale manuscript painting. In other words, paintings that are in text based manuscripts, and not like European painting on large scale panels and canvases and so forth, but rather directly and very closely associated with the text. And these texts are the classical texts, ordinarily, like the Shahnameh, like the Khamseh of Nizami, Divan of Hafiz, and so on and so forth. And I will come back to some of those in relation to how do we look at these paintings, and to think in terms of the paintings not as illustrating the text, but rather as taking the meanings of the text, the nuances of the meanings, to new heights, offering the viewer and the reader, or the person with the book in hand, opportunities to think in terms of their own time period, in terms of their own personal relationship to the environment within which they live. those are some of the issues that will come up, and the aspects of this painting really helped me at the very least point out to what I intend to do in these series. Amongst those is to point to the fact that this painting belongs to a particular period in the history of Persian painting, which is associated with the reign of the family of Timur. We call them Timurids or Teimurian. And indeed, this was made for the Kitabkhane, the workshop, atelier, scriptorium, library of Prince Baysungur, who was a grandson of Timur, a son of Shahrukh and Goharshad, his wife, a great patron of the arts, a calligrapher of note of his own time, and that his Kitabkhane was amongst the most important centers of production of manuscripts in the first half of the 15th century. So Kitabkhane is one subject to which we will come back. I also wanted to point out the fact that we look at these paintings as something that is extraordinarily creative in terms of how the viewer, the act of seeing actually is directed in these paintings, how we are supposed to see them, how the perspective, or the intuitive rather, perspective of the position of the viewer and the painting and the relationship of the figures within and the spaces within which they exist are articulated in Persian painting in a way that is what earns it the title or the distinction as Persian painting. So this is a style. This is a particular manner of visual imagining, which is different from others of great sort of fame, if you will. And I'd like us to think a little bit about some of those issues as well. What I'd like to do is then speak about what is actually Persian painting and what is it about. I want to point to the fact that many of these paintings, the one I just showed you, was made in Herat. Herat today is in Afghanistan, and Persian may indicate that something very sort of specific to Iran of today is intended. Whereas that's not the point. When we call it Persian painting, the point is about the text in Persian language. That's what the point of reference would be. Some scholars have moved on to call such paintings from places that are from this larger area where Persian language was the language of high culture as Persianate painting. A point that may have some validity, but I shall continue calling these on the basis of the linguistic specificity of Persian text, in fact. Are these Islamic painting? That's a very important question in my mind, which brings out the very important point on what is actually Islamic art. What do we mean by calling things Islamic art, of which such paintings might be a subcategory? And in fact, in the end, I'd like us to think in terms of how do we compare Persian painting in a broader context of painting traditions of the world, which we categorize as European painting or Chinese painting, or is it like Italian painting? There are some issues here which are very problematic. For instance, Italy as a country doesn't exist until later in 19th century and so forth, just as we are really nation state-based art histories don't really materialize until much later in the period of nation states. So how do we deal with these issues will come out in the discussions that will follow. I also today wanted to at least point out histories. There is something to be said about a long tradition of painting in the greater Iranian expanse, which is to say, not borders of Iran of today, but this very large territory, which has had at various points in history, sort of coming together as collectives. So it has been argued that wall paintings of the Sogdian in Panjikand in Central Asia, which are prior to the arrival of Islam, are a background to Persian painting. Of these, we have a number also in Afrasiab. And the point about these is that there is a tradition of painting in this greater Iranian world, which comes through wall paintings, perhaps, or through such objects as this beaker, which is a glazed ceramic of the Minai ware in the Freer and Sackler in Washington, D.C., with this 3 bands of figural representations which depict, it seems, the story of Bijan and Manise. So detached from the story that the Shahnameh brings to us, but recognizable in the way these little cartoon-like banners move around this rather large beaker and recall visually aspects of the story of Bijan and Manise. Are these paintings actually, or should they be considered part of the tradition of Persian painting? The other group that comes into mind or to mind is what scholars have called Arab painting. And this is, these are examples from the Maqamat of Al-Hariri on the left, which was made in Baghdad, and the one on the right, which was made in Mosul in northern Iraq, both of which precede the arrival of the Mongols and the sack of Baghdad and the complete destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, under which Baghdad was the center of production, as was Mosul, actually. These have been considered as Arab painting and stylistically thought to be the precursor, if you will, to what becomes Persian painting. Which is interesting to think about in terms of the first manuscripts which have painting in them and survive from the Persianate world or in Persian language texts are in fact related to the post-Mongol period. So there is something about this notion of representation, let's say a seated or enthroned ruler, of these 2 examples. This on the right-hand side is a textile piece, and on the left is a painting. They share certain qualities of pictorial representation, which might indicate that what we call Arab painting was of course known and prevalent perhaps in the Iranian world, let's say, before the Ilkhani formation of the Ilkhani dynasty, which is the inheritors of Genghis Khan's, or the members of the family of Genghis Khan, who conquers all of Asia. And on the west side of it, Iran and Iraq of today fall under the rule of the Ilkhanites. That's when we find the first manuscripts with illustrations or paintings like the Shahnameh, the great Mongol Shahnameh, which is an example of which is on the screen. This page depicts the story of Alexander the Great and his death, being mourned, in fact, quite lively scene of activity here. These are the earliest examples. It's around 1300, 1330 or so, when we begin to see the emergence of a large-scale production of manuscripts for which painting is an important part. And all of these are in fact related to the city of Tabriz, where under the rule of the Ilkhanate, Ghazan Khan and Oljaitu, there is a very active library, Kitabkhane, set up under the supervision of the famous Rashid ad-Din, who commissions production of Jami' al-Tawarikh, and in both Persian and Arabic, which he had composed, for them to be illustrated. And then these great Mongol Shahnameh and a number of small Shahnames. That's really the beginning of what we understand to be Persian painting as a style, if you will, as a particular language of visual arts that is related to the Persian language and to the Iranian world, starting in the beginning of 14th century. So what has happened before that in this area is still an enigma to scholars and historians. Was there indeed a project of illustrating texts before this? Is not very clear. Are those wall paintings or menai ware part of this tradition, and where there's things on paper as well, is not known. What I would like to suggest is that we look at it as a facet of the production of visual culture in Iran that is distinctly related to the book and to the text, these classical texts in the Persian language that emerge at their best, really most powerful way, while Iran is, or this greater Iran, is entirely part of the large Islamic world or Islamicate world, that this is about both a continuity of the Iranian past, those ancient Iran, heritage of ancient Iran, but also a new sort of language of Iran, which is in fact very closely related to this merging together, this symbiotic project that is the Iranian Islamic world. I will come back to many of these at a later time. Thank you.